On the map of southern Ukraine, a highly critical node stands out right in the heart of the Russian defense network, which was thought to be impenetrable for 3 years. Located in the plains of Zaporizhia, Mala Tokmachka, this is not just a small town, it is one of the most important military shields locking in the fate of the war in the south. Russian forces spent years turning this settlement into an impassable steel wall, blocking the road to the city of Tokmak. This stagnant situation on the front line had lasted so long that it was thought the red line of occupation in Mala Tokmachka would never change again. However, military history has repeatedly proven to us that no static defense line can hold out forever against innovative tactics and a determined strategy. Between May 17th and 20th, Kiev showed us a striking example of this because Putin had to see in a very bitter way that his 3 years of efforts were wasted in Mala Tokmachka. The vast plains of Mala Tokmachka, which had remained silent for months, entered Kiev's crosshairs. With a surprise move, Ukrainian forces managed to strike into the operational depth of the Russian troops in the settlement. According to ISW reports, that key point, Mala Tokmachka, which had been held under heavy military buildup for years, was finally liberated from occupation as a result of this operation. After a long time, Ukraine's blue and yellow flags are waving once again in the ruined streets of the town. Moreover, this massive operational breakthrough on the field was not limited solely to the borders of Mala Tokmachka. The settlement of Bilohiria, which forms the immediate eastern flank of the settlement and is of vital importance for the integrity of the Russian defense line, was also secured with a simultaneous maneuver. The coordinated transition of both key points into Ukrainian control appears merely as the tip of the iceberg because the liberation operation of Mala Tokmachka, which also paved the way for the liberation of the Bilohiria settlement, was not easy at all. In the period leading up to May 20th, Ukraine made multiple attempts to liberate the town. The first attempt that brought today's success took place exactly 3 years ago in the summer. At that time, the Ukrainian staff aimed to directly breach the enemy lines with the shock effect created by the newly supplied heavy armored platforms from the west. To execute this critical mission, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the most equipped and trained unit of the army at the time, was assigned to the foremost line of the front. The brigade's operational inventory consisted of German-made Leopard 2A4 and Leopard 2A6, main battle tanks, along with American-made Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. The operation plan was quite clear, and a massive armored force was expected to physically crush and overrun the Russian defense lines. However, Russian engineering units had laid one of the most dense and complex minefields in world military history around Mala Tokmachka. For this reason, Kiev suffered significant losses and could only advance a few kilometers in the settlement. Yet the dynamic nature of war is always open to change for modern armies, capable of objectively analyzing failures and generating new tactical solutions. The Ukrainian army also learned very vital military lessons from that heavy operational bottleneck and armored combat crisis in its first attempt. This time, Kiev was determined to enter Mala Tokmachka one last time and completely expel the Russian occupation forces from the settlement. Cumbersome armored convoys were replaced by the integration of unmanned systems, electronic warfare, and highly mobile small tactical infantry units. When the calendar showed May 20th, 2026, the Ukrainian army returned to the field for the final operation against Mala Tokmachka with this flawlessly functioning new military machine. This time, the main backbone of the operation was undertaken by the 118th Mechanized Brigade instead of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. The initial phase of the operation began not with artillery fire, but with highly silent and detailed reconnaissance flights by invisible unmanned systems in the sky. Drone operators created a three-dimensional and high-resolution digital map of the Russian defense lines in Mala Tokmachka using advanced thermal and optical sensors. Every single Russian command and control point, hidden artillery battery, camouflaged logistics dump, and personnel gathering area in the region was marked with pinpoint accuracy. This real-time intelligence data was integrated into the systems of Ukraine's electronic warfare units, moving to the most critical stage of the operation. The moment powerful electronic jamming and suppression systems were activated, all radio frequencies and local tactical radar networks used by the Russian troops were blinded. Communication between the forward outposts in Mala Tokmachka and the main command centers in the rear was instantly severed before the Russian side even realized what was happening. With their command and control mechanism paralyzed, the occupying troops completely lost their ability to move in an organized manner, provide status reports, and call for emergency artillery support on the field. In military doctrine, this situation is called operational isolation, and this is one of the greatest vulnerabilities an army can experience on the battlefield. The Russian forces experienced this exact situation in Mala Tokmachka. Then Ukrainian artillery batteries took the stage and began firing precision-guided munitions directly at those predetermined critical coordinates. The targeted points were not ordinary infantry trenches, but directly the ammunition depots, electronic warfare vehicles, and communication nodes of the Russian army. The pinpoint artillery support fire reduced the Russian army's organized firepower and logistical resilience in Mala Tokmachka to a minimum level in a very short time. Later, the highly mobile mechanized infantry elements of the 118th Mechanized Brigade deployed to the field. This brigade masterfully infiltrated the town's perimeters in small, autonomous, and initiative-taking tactical units, utilizing all the intricacies of urban combat. These units isolated and neutralized Russian defense points one by one. This tactical approach rendered the Russian army's numerical personnel superiority in Mala Tokmachka meaningless. The Kremlin's army was even forced to flee the settlement. Elements of Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army, responsible for the main defense of the region, could not maintain their operational integrity in the face of this asymmetric pressure coming from land and air. In particular, the 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division, which was expected to hold the line, could not coordinate its troops due to command weakness, and they scattered without even being able to execute an organized retreat. Even the VDV airborne elements, considered to be the most elite and disciplined units of the Russian army, could not defend their positions against this technological and tactical superiority. The 71st and 291st Motorized Rifle Regiments deployed in the region were also shocked, suffering severe personnel casualties and equipment losses. These units were forced to abandon their defense lines and retreat towards the south. On the other hand, Ukraine did not just secure internal control of the town of Mala Tokmachka. At the same time, they also breached the TO8-15 highway, one of the most critical transportation lines on the southern axis. Pushing beyond this highway indicates that Ukraine has created a highly secure tactical salient towards the Russian defense depth, one that constantly threatens the enemy, because the control of the TO8-15 highway provides the Ukrainian army with a much safer springboard for new operations to be conducted in the southern direction. In other words, Russian forces lost control of both Mala Tokmachka and this important logistical artery. Ukrainian troops have now gained the opportunity to easily set up their surveillance systems, electronic warfare antennas, and UAV launch ramps in these areas. This new and unobstructed field of view allows Ukrainian forces to monitor a vast area stretching for kilometers to the south, like the back of their hand, and to instantly bring it under fire. And right in the center of these vast monitored farmlands lies the city of Tokmak, the military, logistical, and operational heart of the Russian army on the Zaporizhia front. This city is the most critical main distribution center that feeds all Russian military operations in the south, supplies ammunition, coordinates casualty evacuations, and keeps the system alive. Heavy ammunition trains, fuel tankers, and fresh troop convoys coming from the Crimean Peninsula or the eastern regions gather in this city before being distributed to the units on the front. This new forward position of the Ukrainian army has brought the city of Tokmak and all the military facilities around it directly and clearly into artillery range. Advanced long-range artillery systems, multiple rocket launchers, and heavy-class attack drones can now monitor logistical movements around Tokmak around the clock. This constant threat of surveillance and strikes prevents the Russian army from safely using its ammunition depots and personnel gathering areas inside Tokmak. The Russian command echelon is inevitably forced to withdraw assault troops from the front line and shift them to the defense of the city to protect this distribution center. However, the defense of the city of Tokmak is not just a local problem for that region. It is directly connected to the military presence and resilience of the entire southern front extending down to Crimea. because this increasing operational pressure in the direction of Tokmak ultimately poses a very serious threat to the main supply routes heading to the city of Mariupol and feeding the Russian army. Mariupol, on the other hand, is the largest administrative, political, and logistical epicenter of the geopolitical land bridge that Russia established using military force between the Crimean Peninsula and the eastern Ukrainian regions. In particular, that railway line connecting directly to Melita via the Novoboden station is highly critical. This is the sole route for transporting heavy armored vehicles and high-tonnage howitzer ammunition to the front, because Russian military doctrine is historically heavily dependent on railway logistics. The security of these railway lines is important enough to determine the fate of the entire frontline operation. Thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel needed by the army cannot be sustainably delivered to the front line without railways. The M14 highway running parallel to the same route is another vital artery constantly used for the rapid deployment of motorized infantry units. The Ukrainian army's increased firepower capacity southward through Tokmak is shaking and destabilizing Russia's entire logistical architecture in the south to its core, because the risk of railway lines being directly hit by Ukrainian artillery or drones forces the Russian army into much slower, costlier road transportation. Transporting the cargo that a train can carry in a single trip via road requires hundreds of military trucks. And this situation makes the logistics chain quite fragile. However, the flawlessly executed operational planning of the Ukrainian General Staff is not limited only to the Zaporizhia axis. It extends to a much broader and more strategic geographical sphere of influence, because Kiev is simultaneously bringing this massive pressure in Tokmak to distant alternative supply routes. In particular, other distant arteries providing supplies to the Crimean Peninsula from the mainland are becoming the main focal point of Ukrainian UAV interdiction operations. The R280 highway, which starts from the city of Rostov-on-Don and extends all the way to Crimea via occupied Mariupol and Berdansk, stands at the very top of these strategic targets. This route had virtually become the single indispensable lifeline for the Russian army. Additionally, this had long been the safe and fast corridor through which Russian military transports, fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and fresh forces flowed most heavily. However, the Ukrainian army is turning the military traffic on this highway into a complete nightmare for the occupying forces with extended range, FPV drones, and autonomous attack systems. By hitting their targets with a high hit rate, these drones are paralyzing shipments on the highway. Especially within the borders of the occupied Karen region, Russian military transport vehicles are being ruthlessly hunted down by low radar signature Ukrainian drones. This situation, in turn, brings the logistical flow behind the front line to a complete standstill. This crisis has even become a talking point for the occupation officials in the region. Viator Salaldo, the head of the Russian collaborationist administration in the Karen region, could no longer hide this massive logistical security problem in the region. On May 21st, Salo completely banned civilian truck and lorry traffic on the most critical and longest sections of the R280 highway. Specifically targeted were those long and vulnerable lines between the 463rd and 494th kilometer towards Jankoy, which is the main route for crossing into the Crimean Peninsula. Both of these arteries were indefinitely closed to all types of commercial and civilian passage, except for approved military shipments. Such administrative bans are the most concrete administrative evidence that Ukrainian drone operations in the region have created a strategic impact on the Russian army. An army's combat power is directly measured not just by the number of tanks it possesses, but by the amount of fuel and ammunition it can deliver to those tanks on time. With this very flawless military strategy, the Ukrainian army has achieved a direct tactical armored advance on one side of the front. The process, starting with Mala Tokmachka, which enabled all these events, actually shows us something very important. This remarkable local military success is not actually just the changing of a village's color on the map. This is the most critical and successful step of a grand war of attrition strategy that encompasses the entire southern front and aims to sever the Russian army logistically. As the Russian command delegation panic shifts forces from other fronts to cover a vulnerability in one area, Ukrainian intelligence can instantly detect these weakened new lines and prepare its next devastating attack plans. Furthermore, the Russian army, which is constantly trying to plug gaps by staying on the defensive, may lose all of its proactive movement capability on the field. This asymmetric technology-focused style of operation is an example of the collapse of the Russian army's cumbersome, centralized, and railway-centric rigid command structure. As of May 2026, the new and dynamic situation created by this major operational breakthrough on the field could yield much more comprehensive, deep, and strategic results planned for the upcoming summer months. Ukrainian troops can ceaselessly continue their forward reconnaissance activities and electronic warfare, eavesdropping over these new defense and attack lines that they have successfully captured and rapidly fortified. But the most important point is much broader in scope than this, because with this advance, Kiev is seizing the chance to show that Crimea's land connection to the mainland may not remain the same from Russia's perspective. Meaning this great tactical advantage obtained on the southern axis by paying heavy prices and gaining immense experience could bring far more surprising effects than expected. In short, the changing flags and related streets in Mala Tokmachka proved how military history can change in an instant. Ukraine has perhaps seized the chance on the southern front lines that it hasn't been able to achieve for a long time. Now, the only matter of curiosity is what will happen next. It seems Kiev has two options before it. First is to establish full control over the entirety of the Zaporizhia lines and the southern fronts during this period that started with Mala Tokmachka. Another option is to shift the focus to Crimea while simultaneously doing all of this, meaning a dual pincer move. Of course, we may also face different scenarios. However, the latest situation does not look very heartwarming for Russia, at least for now. Well, what do you think about this topic? We look forward to your comments. To make long journeys more enjoyable, we also invite you to Spotify, where we present our video content. Thank you for choosing us. Presented by TGN.